I'm very happy to be here with you today and sharing some ideas with you about a topic that I'm really passionate about. So my journey started with my studies in industrial engineering, and there I first encountered during my bachelor's studies the field of systems thinking. And from there, my life changed. So I pursued that into my doctoral studies and into my master's studies, which each tackled different dimensions of systems thinking, from the qualitative side to the quantitative mathematical side, which is called system dynamics. And then at some point, I realized that a lot of the important things in life cannot be represented mathematically. And that's where my journey started in psychoanalysis. And basically, I see psychoanalysis as systems thinking applied to the inner world, to the world that is within us. Because systems thinking is mainly applied to understanding of complexity that is out there, be it in an organization, in, let's say, the context of the relationship with clients or suppliers, in supply chains, in climate studies, and so on and so forth. But applications of systems thinking to understand complexities in the inner world is the field of psychoanalysis. So when people ask me, how come you went to mathematics or psychoanalysis? I say, well, they're all one and the same thing. They're looking at complexities and they're offering lenses to view different types of complexities. So what I'm going to be sharing today with you is going to be a little bit unconventional probably. So this is not going to be let's say the conventional systems thinking talk, because these are all my ideas. So I'm not citing anyone. I'm not borrowing the definition of systems thinking from any already published work. I'm basically sharing with you my relationship to systems thinking and how I see it and how I connect to it, especially from a psychoanalytic point of view. What does it mean? What exactly this lens entails that is different from the existing lenses? So in order to understand this, we need to understand the orientations of our psyche. Our psyche is oriented to worlds, either the world of inner objects or the world of outer objects. This is the first two orientations we're going to look at today. And this is the orientations of the conscious psyche, because we also have the unconscious psyche that we will not get into today. So, world of outer objects, we are very familiar with the world of outer objects, from a baseball bat to a building to a molecule to a course to a position at a company. These are all outer objects. But when it comes to the world of inner objects, we have a difficulty in general to identify elements of the world of inner objects. Inner objects are more like dreams, fantasies, ideals, emotions. They are very, very tacit and subtle. The world of symbols, those are all inner objects. Now, our psyche is oriented to understand these two worlds. So we have two orientations pointing at inner objects and the outer objects. Now, when we look at the functions that look at these, we have the intuition function that is directed to the world of inner objects, and then we have the sensation function that basically perceives the world of outer objects. This is our sensory inputs, basically, the five senses that we have. Each one is basically there to help us perceive outer objects. And on the other hand, we have the intuition function that is there to help us apprehend these inner objects. So through intuition function, we can connect to basically those ideas that I told you, like the world of symbolic thinking, understanding somehow the emotions, connecting to the dreams, fantasies, creating them, and so on and so forth. But apart from these esoteric dimensions, there is more to the intuition function. So intuition function is a big picture function. It's something that looks at the holistics, at the trends. It looks at how things evolve. It looks at the big picture. It's not interested in details. It's more interested in potentialities than actualities. But the sensation function is more about here and now. What do we have? Let's analyze it. What is it made of? How much does it weigh? How much does it cost? Where does it come from? But intuition function, on the other hand, looks at the potentialities associated with this, extends that object into future, adds a touch of imagination to it. So this is a key word here. Whereas the sensation function is more about being grounded in the now, in the present moment, and looking at the object at hand. So these are the two functions that we have. Now, we have two more orientations to the psyche. I'll get to them. But before that, just to give you an idea, our world was very much oriented towards the intuition function in the past, before the scientific revolution and the age of exploration. We were much more in tune with our intuition function. So some subjects like astrology, some like alchemy, mythology, they're all expressions of the intuition function. And each of them got transformed later on. So you look at this picture, this is from early 16th century, and these are the two ambassadors. And you can see the dominance of the sensation function in this picture. This is where the moment where things started to switch from intuition more towards sensation, where we started conquering the nature, exploring the seas. So you can see here there is a lot of elements that are linked to the outer world. There is not even an inch of this picture that is not covered by an object, an outer world object. So from the clothes that are wearing and the decorative carpets or all these scientific instruments or musical instruments, there is this shift happened. So from astrology, we started moving towards astronomy. From alchemy, we started moving towards chemistry. And mythology and history, which were intertwined in the past, got completely decoupled. So this is just an idea to give you what type of, let's say, space or semantic space we're talking about when we talk about intuition versus sensation. Now, we have two other orientations of the psyche. One is logic and rationality, and one is towards values and ideals. These are two very important orientations. And the thinking function is the function that takes care of the logic and rationality. And feeling function basically brings in the values and ideals of individuals. That's how we end up doing things that are not logical at all, that are not rational at all. The feeling function gets involved. So if you look at this picture of the orientations of the psyche in form of a manufacturing company, we can say that the intuition and the sensation function bring the input, bring the raw materials in a way. And then the feeling function and the thinking function process them. So these two functions are assessment or perception functions. Intuition and sensation functions are perceptions. They help us perceive things. And then we have the assessment functions, which are feeling and thinking functions. They help us assess, evaluate, and move on to a decision. So whatever action that we take is the result of a decision. Whatever decision that we have is the result of an assessment that is made. And whatever assessment that we have is basically a product of the perception processes that are at work. So this gives us a little bit of an idea about the orientation of the psyche. I don't want to get deep into this, just like a primer so that we can have a better understanding of the topic that we want to look at today. Now, once we combine the thinking function with the sensation function, we get the analytic thinking. If we combine thinking function and the intuition function, we get the synthetic thinking. We know synthetic thinking as holistic thinking, as lateral thinking. Analytic thinking probably is known more like vertical thinking. So these two types of thinkings are different primarily because of the orientation of the psyche that is used inside them. If you bring in the intuition, it gives you a different and commingle it with thinking. It gives you a different type of thinking. If you bring sensation and mix and match it with thinking, it gives us a completely different type of thinking. To a degree that people who are oriented very much to this side may not be able to talk to the other people who are oriented to the other side. They both are thinking, but they are really two ends of a spectrum. So there's a lot of tension between these two types of thinking. Now, for me, systems thinking is an attempt to transcend this tension and bring a type of thinking in which we mix and match analytic and synthetic thinking. So it's a thinking that combines the thinking function along with intuition and sensation at the same time. So basically, systems thinking is a type of thinking that allows the most diverse type of input through our perception functions to be fed into our thinking function. Systems thinking is not one of these two sides. It's not the synthetic thinking. Many people equate it with holistic thinking, but it's not. It's pretty much different. And it's very important to emphasize this notion that systems thinking transcends it, which means a systems thinker is not doing a little bit of analytic thinking and then doing synthetic thinking. A systems thinker is combining these two types of thinking in a way that he does not actually know which one he's using that moment. They are really basically embedded together, intertwined. Like, I would say, water, which is liquid, but it's created out of two different molecules of gas, basically. So gas comes together, becomes water. Two different types of thinking come together and become systems thinking. It's not that we yo-yo between these two and don't go back and forth between them. It's a type of thinking that has both embedded. At every moment you're looking at the big picture and you're looking at the details together. You see the forest and you see the trees at the same time. Now, this is just like an intro so far for us. And now let's see what we can do with this. How can we relate it to the situation that we are experiencing now, in design especially? First, I want to bring, we talked about alchemy and we talked about astrology. Some people may have already freaked out, hearing these esoteric terms. Now I'm bringing something, people who are more oriented towards the sensation and the thinking function, they may say, oh, what are these things? So now we're bringing something from Amazon so that we can balance this off a little bit. So in the letter to the shareholders in 2018, there is a paragraph that, in my opinion, distinguishes these two types of thinking in a nice way. So sometimes, often in business, you do know where you're going. This is the vertical thinking. You do know where you're going. You're just following. It's a very sure course of path that you're following. And when you do, you can be efficient. And again, analytic thinking is also efficiency maximizing. It's very results-oriented type of thinking. You put in place a plan and you execute. In contrast, wandering in business is not efficient, but it's not also random. It's guided by hunch, gut, intuition, curiosity, empowered by deep conviction that whatever it is where the customer is working, and then it says, wandering is an essential counterbalance to efficiency. Basically, you're saying that synthetic thinking is a good counterbalance to analytic thinking. So the outsized discoveries, the nonlinear ones, are highly likely to require wandering. So thinking combined with intuition can enable us to reach out to some basically ideas that are not incremental improvement to existing ones, but radical discoveries or outsized discoveries. This is, I think this is a nice way of outlining it. And going to one of my favorite thinkers, Gregory Bateson, says the major problems in the world are the result of the difference between how nature works and the way people think. So we really need to reflect on the way we think and whether it matches the dynamics of the situations that we are in contact with and we want to basically manage in a way. You all heard the parable of the blind man and the elephant. This is, again, a way of looking at these two different types of thinking. And in our world, we have a domination of analytic thinking. You just look at everywhere. It's one of those, when people talk about inequality, one of the first things that comes to my mind is this. We are very unequally oriented towards using our psyche. We use analytic thinking in a predominant way, in many and most situations in which it should not be used. So one example is this, which is breaking things in boxes, neatly separated from each other, with different colors, logos and stuff. This breaking down is analytic thinking. You're all familiar with all these canvases that are being used. Again, breaking something down, looking at the elements of it, and sometimes a little bit of looking at the relationships as well. But the problem I see with these is like we have a broken mirror and we want to put the pieces back together to create a perfect reflection. It just doesn't happen like that. We need to have a different approach towards thinking from the beginning. And these approaches exist. If you look at, for instance, the Climate Interactive Initiative for the climate studies and the global warming crisis, this is an approach that is basically compatible with systems thinking. There's a lot of analytics going on there, but at the same time, we have the big picture. You can start moving any of these levers to increase things by percentages and then see how this small increase can result in a change at the systems level. And this is not something new. Limits to growth has been there for a long time. From the 70s, this has been, let's say, a movement that didn't gain much traction, basically. So these ways of looking or this type of thinking exists. In my courses, I used to bring some small blocks for making buildings to my students with 2 large bottles of water. And I would ask them to build a bridge that can support the weight of these 2 bottles with those pieces, and also at the same time allows the 2 bottles to pass underneath it. What they always did, without exception, was to build the pillars. 2 columns were raised immediately. And then the moment they were up there, they would raise their hands and ask, how do we connect these? And I would tell them that is the bridge. The bridge is the connection, it's not the pillars. You have 2 columns right now. You don't have a bridge. So you should think about the connection from the moment that you put the first building block down. You cannot postpone this to the end. We need to look at the element and the final product at the same time if you want to make it. And once they had this change of mindset, things would be very different and they would be able to look at things differently. So in our education, we are suffering from that as well. In the games that we play, spotting the 7, 12 differences, these are all analytic thinking. Looking at something and see what the difference is. And what I like to say about these type of exercises, these type of approaches to education, and say that we are focusing on finding meaningless differences between visibly similar entities. But what we need to do, in fact, is finding meaningful similarities between seemingly different entities. So this is the task. This is the switch that we need to have. And I want to share with you a couple of personal stories that how this approach, change of approach in looking and in observing and in thinking has helped me define my path for life. These 2 pages, you're probably familiar with the 12 labors of Hercules. And on the right-hand side, I'm originally from Iran, we have the Persian myth in which the hero goes through 7 labors, but the first of which is again a lion. So once I read the 12 labors of Hercules, I said, wait a second, these guys are like centuries apart in time. How is it possible that this cannot be a coincidence, that these labors begin with the lion for both of them? That moment was an important moment that I saw that. And later on, when I looked at all these fairy tales that we have, like Beauty and the Beast, Harry Potter, Wizard of Oz, Rumpelstiltskin, some of them are more well-known than the others. I realized that there is a pattern that connects them, basically. There is a similarity between them that is significant. And despite the differences in the narratives and, let's say, the story arc and so on and so forth, there is a very significant similarity between them, which is the mother of the hero is missing. The absence of the positive mother energy is a thread that connects a lot of fairy tales. And that was an aha moment. What is it that all these diverse fairy tales coming from different sources, coming from different time, they are telling us basically a narrative that has a significance that is hidden behind the veil of the characters, of the stories, and of the, let's say, details of each of these fairy tales. So that was a second important moment for me, and something that turbocharged my studies in psychoanalysis, because that's the field where we go back to the psyche of the human being and the collective unconscious of basically the historical human being, to see what are the patterns that can account for understanding such basically observations. Now, going back to Bateson, he also says that he is a pattern man. He's a man who is interested in patterns. Ask, what's the pattern that connects the crab to the lobster, the primrose to the orchid, and all of them to me, and me to you? Heraclitus, like 500 years before Christ, talks about the fact that the cosmos speaks to us in patterns. So this ability to see patterns is something very significant, is a part of the human condition that somehow we are detached from. And more we get detached from. You look at academia, the number of academic disciplines that we have is just increasing at a radical rate. The number of specialized journals as well, it's just we're at the age of hyper specialization, of just going into the extreme point of analytical thinking and somehow losing touch with the other counterbalance, which is basically looking into patterns, pattern thinking, and bringing these two into a harmonious and into a balanced relationship. This book, Scale, is the efforts of a physicist who is looking into patterns. So he's an analytical thinker in a way, but he's brought a lot of pattern thinking into his work. And he looks at mammals. He says that we have the smallest mammal, which is a shrew, from 2 grams to the blue whale, which is 100 million grams bigger than the shrew. And biologists can find 100,000 of different types of shrews. That's the analytical thinking, and which is valuable. But what he looks at, he says, if you look at the heartbeat per lifetime of mammals, you see that more or less we can have basically an estimate that can tell us that it's more or less the same. So it's not the number of years that count in the life of a mammal, it's the heartbeat that counts. So the 70, 80 years or 100 years that we live can equate the very short life of a hamster, of a shrew, which if the shrew skips a meal, he's going to die because heart beats so fast that it needs to be constantly fed. So then you realize that the measure of life is not time, it's basically the total number of heartbeats that we have. So these are the ways of looking that can bring new perspectives and bring new meaning to life. And I'm making a case here for pattern thinking because that's the type of thinking that is most ignored and alienated. Anything that is linked to pattern thinking in a way, it's somehow looked at as esoteric. One other example from my life before we go on. At some point, I like cinema a lot, and I keep talking about the movies that I like to people that I like. And at some point, one of my friends said, "Hey, Arash, there is this YouTube video. You got to go watch it because the movies, like 80%, 90% of the movies you mentioned are listed on that. And they are so diverse, the movies that I like, like here is 4 of the movies that were on that list. We have 2001: A Space Odyssey, Apocalypse Now, The Third Man, and The Night of the Hunter. Different genres, different directors, different time horizons, nothing in common between them, really. I always thought probably the only thing common between them is that I like them. But then this friend of mine showed me this YouTube video that was something like most pleasing, most aesthetically pleasing cinematic experiences. And then I realized, oh my God, all these movies have an aesthetic dimension to them. So every frame of them is shot in a way that can be framed basically and put on a wall. And then through that pattern thinking, I realized that, well, this aesthetic dimension is so subtle and so powerful in my life that I need to look into more to see where else is it. Because if it's so subtle, it just shows that it's dominating a lot of other choices in my life without me being aware of them. So this is another example from pattern thinking, moving from, let's say, events into seeing relationships and patterns over time. And this is what we need to be thinking about. Events is about now, here. It's more like analytic in nature. Something happened right now. And we go there, we see it, we observe it, we examine all different dimensions of it. We ground ourselves in that event. That's the analytic thinking. That's the use of senses, the sensory inputs, evidences, facts, figures, all about that certain event. We delimit it, we understand it. Next step is basically understanding the patterns and trends. So this event is basically a part of these patterns understood in isolation. So we isolate a part of the pattern, we take it out and then look at it as an event. We need to place it back and look at it as a trend, as a pattern over time. And once we do that, we can see that there is basically structures that generate these patterns. These patterns are being generated through structures. They're not just patterns recurring on their own automatically. There is a design, there is a structural design behind them that basically results in their creation. And once we look at those, we realize that those underlying structures are products of mental models and assumptions, or the paradigms or the worldviews of an individual or a group of individuals. So this is you're all probably familiar with this iceberg view, but now I'm again putting it in a new context that we can see the beginning part of it is more analytic thinking, and then as we go down more, we bring the intuition function. And intuition, as I told you, is more about connecting, is more about big picture, is more about imagination rather than observations, direct observations at the moment. And this is, in my opinion, crucial in the work of design that we do, especially the more down we come in this iceberg, the trickier it becomes to understand. If going from events to patterns is difficult, then understanding the structures that generate these patterns is even a more difficult task. And the mental models are that part that is almost invisible, and very, very difficult to look, because as a designer, if you want to look at your mental model is actually looking at itself in a way. So you have some assumptions or ideas. You need to find a way of these ideas being looked at, but not these ideas constantly looking at stuff. That's the difficulty. And sometimes we identify so much with our assumptions and with our ideas that the moment they want to be looked at, we panic. So getting down to the bottom of this, where the mental models are, is really the trickiest thing to do. And that's where we need some inputs that looks at us and basically scans us and reports back at us about those hidden mental models that we have that we might not even be aware of, basically. So this is a very important dimension to know that this is not an easy task to move. We know the iceberg, but putting it into use is really a tricky thing. And especially when it comes to the mental models. One thing I do when it comes to somehow revealing the mental models of an individual is working with metaphors. And if you ask someone to come up with a metaphoric design, if you ask, for instance, a couple, look at your married life and give me the first metaphor that comes to your mind. And if they say, well, it's a journey. Well, that's a nice metaphor. Or someone say, well, it's more like a game. Then there's an element of competition, there's winning, losing, whereas in the journey, it's something that is towards something, towards a destination. There is a common destination. There is challenges over the way that you need to overcome. There is more a sense of collaboration. So what you can do, ask yourselves, who am I, basically? What metaphor can I use to describe myself in relationship to my, for instance, job, in relationship to myself? If for instance, I would want to pick a movie or a character in a movie, which character would I be? That reveals a lot. Just this type of mapping experiences. We bring the intuition and imagination in a way. So which movie is capturing my life? What metaphor captures the relationship between me and my job and my position and my colleagues? So this is a very useful experience to have, especially in a collective meeting, to ask people to come up with metaphors and see how different these metaphors are. And the beauty of it is that it comes from a part that doesn't have a lot of analytical thinking in it yet. So once it comes out, then you realize, when you start mapping the elements of the metaphor to the object that it's trying to describe, you realize that, wow, it reveals so much about the mindset of the individual. So there are some ideas and techniques for doing this, and at that point you need to connect to something that is beyond the conscious psyche of an individual in order to get an idea about those deep mental models of people. Anyways, so we are back to pattern thinking, and here is a phrase, again, part of a paragraph from one of the books that I like, which emphasizes the importance of pattern thinking and understanding mental models. So he says, if a factory is torn down but the rationality which produced it is left standing, then that rationality will simply produce another factory. If a revolution destroys a systematic government but the systematic patterns of thought that produced that government are left intact, then those patterns will repeat themselves in the succeeding government. There's so much talk about the system and so little understanding. I just so much agree with this sentence. And if we go back here, if you are in the first top two layers, you are mainly doing, in my opinion, problem solving. Problem solving is reactive. If we tap into the lower layers, that's where design comes in. Design needs to do with understanding structures, changing structures. It's not reactive, it's not putting out fire. It's more about transforming the way people think about security, about safety issues that can reduce the chances of a fire incident happening, than coming up with a way of efficiently putting out fire. So it's important to basically understand this distinction, that at this level we are solving the problems. At this level we try to dissolve the problems. If there's a good educational system, then we can avoid a lot of the incidents, the fire incidents that exist at that level. If there are good structures, in terms of materials that are used in the houses, insulation and so on and so forth, we can also do something. But people need to know the importance of these in order to adapt those structures when they make their houses. So I'm getting close to the end of my conversation today. And what about the feeling side? Because we connected these two sides and we talked about the synthetic thinking, the analytic thinking. But what about the feeling? And that's one of the issues I have with the design thinking field, because there is no feeling in it. So we also need to have design feeling if we want to have basically a balanced way. The way it stands for me right now, design thinking, as it stands, with all the tools and canvases and techniques that it has, stands at this quadrant. We have 3 more quadrants to bring a balanced approach to perception and to assessment into design. And I believe a lot of design actually happens on the top 2 quadrants. And a lot of, let's say, transformative, generative design happens at this level. a lot of, let's say, incremental problem solving, implementing stuff, efficiency seeking, results oriented type of initiatives somehow fall in the bottom quadrants. So the top quadrants that bring the intuition and feeling and thinking in a way together are the quadrants that can help us achieve something with the help of imagination that analytic thinking can never see, that empathizing with our customers, just looking around at what they need and bringing that to them, will never achieve. So this is basically the picture that I want you to walk away with and locate yourself whenever you're choosing a tool or a technique on this canvas. Where are you, basically? Which conscious orientation of the psyche are you using? And when you look at the word design, it has a root in common with signification, or in French we say signification, significance, signature. So there is something about importance and then meaning. Signification in French means meaning. There's something of that sort. There's something meaning. There needs to be something meaningful and meaningfully significant in design. And when you talk about meaning, you're talking about subjective dimensions of individuals. You're not talking about rationality. You're more talking about individual compass of values, of ideals, individual imaginative capabilities. Those things that really make us human. And I believe anything analytic thinking will very soon be outsourced to algorithms. So our power lies into activation of these two worlds. So we didn't get a chance to talk about these. That could be a topic of a next conversation whenever that could happen. But I want you to walk out of this session with one last idea. This is an idea from a poet, which in my opinion, poets are the best systems thinkers. So this is the opening stanza from T.S. Eliot's Choruses from the Rock. The endless cycle of idea and action, endless invention, endless experiment, brings knowledge of motion, but not of stillness, knowledge of speech, but not of silence. Where is the life we have lost in living? Where is the wisdom we have lost in knowledge? Where is the knowledge we have lost in information? And you can go ahead and say, where is the information we have lost in data? And that defines the data science field in the best way possible, because instead of going from the data, trying to make our way towards knowledge, we have to take the opposite path. Where did we break things down in the first place? Why do we have data with this level of granularity? Why are we measuring things like that in the first place? So sometimes poets, have really deep insights that can be used in the world of design and in the world of science. I'm going to stop here, and I hope this was a useful set of ideas for you, thought-provoking, and I hope that it generated a lot of questions in your mind.